Okay, everybody, 7:30. We'll start proceedings in a moment. Went to Western Australia, did the rail trip across. If anybody's thinking of doing it, I can assure you that the line from Sydney to Broken Hill is like driving a car with flat tyres over a cobblestone road with some of the cobbles missing. It is horrendous. After that, it was okay. It seemed to me that what most people wanted to do there was get down into the lounge room as quick as they could and drink as much of the free grog as they possibly could. That's the Australian way. It's the Australian way, all right. Anybody got any news? Any good news? Yes, please. Got to give you that, haven't I?
We've got an update this week from the Amberley Aviation Heritage Centre of the Boston in Port Moresby. So it's back together again, assembled in its new home. Brand new hangar, not a big hangar, but there's nothing else in there. It's so new. It's so very different for us who are used to seeing it amongst everything else, to see it in a bland concrete cave. But it's there. Helen Pelican is in Port Moresby. It's in its new home, and there will be a ceremony closer to the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the formation of PNG in September or August. Okay.
Anybody not seen the Helen Pelican?
Bob, the Air India crash, a theory now is that it might have been the temperature of the fuel. Apparently, fuel doesn't flow into engines after 49 degrees centigrade, and it was round about that at the aerodrome that day. So the pilot was calling for thrust, wanted thrust, wasn't getting thrust. So no, just an interesting conjecture.
Okay, thank you. I had not heard that one. It's a bit reverse of the British Airways one, where the fuel froze or got too cold.
Why didn't he get his undercoat?
I read a report that said that there was water ingress at the time of the disconnection of the GPU unit because there was torrential rain, and then that caused arcing through the electronic system and caused the engines to wind back to idle after they took off, and the pilots were powerless to do anything, and this is what brought it about. And to me, it seems like over computerization instead of keep things simple. So it was.
Well, it's certainly taking a long time for anything to come out. We haven't even had I guess there wasn't very much on the voice recorder that would have been much use anyway. There would have been a lot of WTFs going on, and that's about it, I think. Anything else from anybody? Got any other at all? The Air India thing seems to be the biggest one.
The one survivor did say that just as it was about to crash, some power started coming on again, but far too late, too little too late.
I did hear that, yes. All right, well, I've got nothing really else to add to it. I've been away, so I apologise for that. And I introduce our speaker tonight. He's one of our own membership of AHSAQ, Rick Davies, and it looks like it's going to be a great story. So go ahead, Rick.
Thank you very much. Something I've got to live up to now. I'm going to partly read this, and I'm going to exaggerate some bits. Well, thanks very much, Peter. A couple of months ago, Bill Mellor, my good friend here, presented a very thorough and a balanced history of Army aviation in Australia. Now, I cannot repeat that. Any efforts on my part would venture us into slow death by PowerPoint, and we're not going to do that. I'd rather share numerous things than historically observed when viewed today. Now, I warn you, there's no logical approach to the presentation I'm going to give tonight, and the slides won't necessarily relate to any of my words. So think of them as background only, and this will be my little protest after so many years of structure. I was brought up on the central coast of New South Wales, and unfortunately I have to back the Blues in the state of origin. That's just the rules. Dad was a digger in World War II. He started out as a telegram boy at Epping Post Office in Sydney. And after the war, the PMG sent him to university and he became an engineer and ended up as general manager of what was Telecom, I think, by then, in New South Wales. Mum was in the Land Army. In later life, she became a social worker, and for her community service was awarded an OAM. Dad disliked officers. I was going to put hated in there, but I thought that was a bit strong. No, hated will do. He really struggled at my graduation parade from sea. I could see him really, really struggling. And he was a bit of an anomaly, really. He was a very senior manager, but he still thought like a digger. I spent 20 years in the regular army, plus 26 years in the reserves. Done troon from 69 to 72, one class behind my mate Billy Mellor. Then I went to 8RAR, who have a wonderful tie. Bill's laughing. And that was 69 to 72, I was there. Then I went to 8 and 9 RAR as a junior officer, a platoon commander, and later assistant adjutant of the battalion. And that's where I learnt leadership. All our senior NCOs, many of our soldiers were Vietnam, some earlier, some of them Korea, and one of them World War II, Korea, and 2 tours in Vietnam. So I did some interesting things there. I was squadron pilot, 2IC of a squadron. I did my instructor's course at East Sale on the CT4 and the Mackie jet. And then I went back to Point Cook as a junior major, as the Army liaison officer, and obviously an instrument rating examiner. Most of my overseas time was spent in the Trobriand Islands and West Irian on Operation Cendrawassi, which was a map-making exercise. Later, as a reservist, I was involved in sending the Nomads to Indonesia. And what a privilege that was. Yeah, yeah. So then I had 10 years at the Department of Transport, Air Transport Group, or CAA or CASA, whatever it was that week. I went to the Sydney office at 59 Goulburn Street, and it was an interesting place. You either went round the state, all around New South Wales doing tests, or you could have a Bankstown week where you did 10 tests in a week, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And the morning one could be on a Cessna 150, and the afternoon could be on a jet. And it was interesting stuff. While I was there in Sydney, I did an ag rating. And I'll tell you a story about my ag rating. It was a pretty interesting time. I did an airspace and instrument approach design course where I had 2 hats. The other one was as an airways surveyor as well as an examiner of airmen. And that was interesting stuff. I did a seaplane rating, and I had dual roles, one as an examiner of airmen and the other as the airways surveyor. Then I went to Darwin as a senior examiner, Don. Yeah. And that was interesting. It was very, very interesting. It was a very different industry to New South Wales. It was an industry that either didn't understand the rules or ignored them anyway. That's the way the Territorians were. but I enjoyed it. And then I had 15 years at the Royal Flying Doctor Service, where I was the manager of flying operations and the chief pilot. I saw much that uplifted me, and I saw things that really saddened me, and it was a combination. There's only one serious thing that I want to talk about. In 1969 at the Royal Military College, this was not a good year for my class, or indeed anybody's class. The bastardisation scandal of 1969. The whistle was blown on the behaviours by an academic, Dr. Jerry Walsh, and the government appointed a formal investigation. The person who was the investigating officer was His Honour Justice Russell Fox, AM, later an AM, QC, LLB. That's a young me. I was saying to Peter before, the sad thing of showing these slides is that when you look at it, half the people have passed away, which I think is really, really sad. The guy on the right-hand side, Dennis Coffey, was the first squadron commander of 173 General Support Squadron, which was the fixed-wing squadron within 1st Aviation Regiment. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's me, the big tall one, skinny. It's hard to believe, isn't it?
Yeah, very hard.
Thanks, Don. That's me on the left.
Right.
Second left. We'll get away from these shortly. They're a bit embarrassing. Second right is a guy called Martin William James Vincent. And he passed away from a very rare cancer, which was a bit sad. So the investigation into the business of 1969 had an interesting outcome. Justice Russell Fox QC was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the ACT. He happened to be a graduate of the College of August of 1940. And in August of 1940, they were running very short courses. For obvious reasons, they needed officers, junior officers for World War II. It is a quality report. I read the report, and I guess my theoretical question is, would it be acceptable in today's environment to nominate somebody who in fact was a graduate? How would modern society take that? Would there not be accusations of a conflict of interest? I suspect in today's environment there would. And that's the end of the serious matters. I want to go to something that happened at Londonderry Drop Zone. Londonderry Drop Zone, I don't have a photo of that, but Londonderry Drop Zone is about 6 or 7 miles to the southwest of RAF Base Richmond. Anybody heard of it, been there?
Well, that's Richmond.
Oh, we've all been to Richmond, I guess. Yep, Bill's been there. So what we were doing with the porter, and we'll show you later, the attachment of the rocket pods also allowed you to attach cargo, which you could take. And one of our favourite things was we could extend our range by putting a 200 litre, we all know it as a 44-gallon drum, under the wings. And when you get somewhere, you can land, drop it, and then refuel. So there was an extra 400 litres of fuel available to you, and that came in handy. So I'm going over to Londonderry Drop Zone, and the really interesting thing was that you had to arm the system before you could either fire rockets or drop stores. So I armed it with about 2 miles to go, sitting at about 1,500 feet, and a 44-gallon drum came off and dropped into the car park of an industrial place. I was somewhat perturbed, as the people who owned the industrial estate were somewhat perturbed as well. Now, it seems that there had been an incorrect wiring on this particular aeroplane, so they couldn't hang me for it. And I was only a very, very junior pilot. That was July the 15th, 1975. And that set a bit of a tone for my aviation career. It was full of accidents and humour and a lot of good luck. When we come to it, I'm going to talk about a guy called Hamish Mahadi. And I've got a photograph of him later on. And I've got some interesting stories about this chap. I also want to talk about the military role in civil aid, or military aid to the civil community. Now, that's been going on a long time, as recently as the floods and as recently as the bad weather on the north coast of New South Wales. Now, in 1975, and 1976, there were very bad floods in the Moree area and the Guida River and the Jumeric on the border. And we went down, we being the fixed wing detachment of the squadron, went down to Moree to help. The interesting thing about that was that the only serviceable airstrips, there was one up on the border and Moree. Everything else was underwater, seriously underwater. And I got a job to go out northwest of Moree to a place, on the way to a place called Garra. And there were some railway workers who'd been trapped on a device on the railway that went there on the corner. And I was asked to go and pick them up, 5 of them in a porter. So I went out to pick them up. And I had a good look at this place, and it was just a road on a corner. And I had a really good look at it. I said, yeah, I can do this. There were power lines across it, but that was no big deal. Landed on the road. I couldn't turn the aeroplane around, so I had to back it up on reverse. And when I stopped, and I closed it down. And one of the guys came up and said, mate, the way you got under that wire. And I thought, well, that's yeah, well, we're getting there. And I said, oh, it's no big deal. We're taught to go under wires. And then when I looked out, it wasn't the wire that I had checked. It was, in fact, a steel wire cable that was attached to a corner of this wire network. And when I looked at it, there was no way that you could put an aeroplane anywhere near it. So God looked down. God just looked down. The other one about Moree was interesting, really, really interesting, was me losing my wallet and my briefcase. Now, for the ex-military aviators amongst you, the briefcase was known as a kit case navigation. Is that familiar to anybody? Bill? Yeah, okay. So I remember this for 2 reasons. One is I had 23 people, mainly kids and a porter, which is pretty crowded. And the other reason was I went up to the border and we dropped some stuff off, food for people who were looking after other people. And all that was in the back of the porter was my nav bag with my wallet and a few maps and the aircraft books. And it had been held down, all the cargo had been held down by a strap. Well, the chap, state emergency service guy, closed the door, but didn't close the door. So as I was taking off, I heard the door go clunk. And I looked around and I thought, oh, this is untidy. You'll be right. I'll get back to Moree. It's only 25, 30 minutes. And then I heard this bang, 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 bang. And it was the strap. And I looked further and the strap was taking my kit case navigation out the door, and out it went. I lost my wallet, my money, everything. And I'm waiting for the day when someone's ploughing a wheat paddock out there northwest of Moree and they come across this artefact. Yeah. There's another one I want to talk to you about. It's about the concept that a horse comes in spray cans. After I first joined the RFDS as the chief pilot and the aviation manager, I was called to a property along with our chief engineer north of Julia Creek. I won't tell you what the property was, because I can't remember, but when I went there, one of our King Airs had hit 3 horses. One horse went through the Pratt & Whitney -42 850 shaft horsepower horse filter, and the other one sort of dodged, and the young one had jumped over the wing but left a hoof print in the flap. So we really only killed one. And when I went and looked at this aeroplane, which had been sitting in the sun for a day, and it didn't smell very nice, and then I thought to myself, it was like someone had spray canned the horse up the side. It was pretty bad. In fact, it was not good at all.
How long did the spray of the horse flower?
Oh, we flew the aeroplane back to Townsville where it came from, and it took a long time to get it clean. It really, really did.
And what's happening here? Mustering.
No, that's just a King Air landing. Yeah, it could be mustering. But the sequel to the story is I was the investigating officer as well. So I went off and spoke to the manager of this property, and I said, but the pilot spoke to you, didn't he, on UHF? And he said, yeah. And I said, what did you say? Were you asked, was there any stock in the paddock? And he said, yes. And I said, well, what did he ask you? He asked me if there's any cattle in the paddock. And I said, yeah. And he said, he didn't ask me about horses. So that was $1 million for a new engine, $250,000 for a new prop, engine out of... I thought to myself, you've got to be different, mate. You've got to be different. All aeroplanes were equipped with UHF, 40-channel UHF, and that was really good because you could talk to property owners and all sorts of people. You could talk to the police, and it was very, very handy when you're going into places. But it was also a good comic relief because going to Brisbane to, if you're going to Brisbane, for example, to Mount Isa, it's 3.5, nearly 4 hours, depending on the wind. And you're sitting up there and you could easily get quite bored. And at the altitudes that we were at, you could hear everybody and speak to everybody within 200 or 300 miles. And after a while, because I was so bored, I developed this little plan. And my little plan was I'd say something, and the language on the UHF and the truck drivers was unbelievable. Anyway, but I worked out this little plan, and I wouldn't identify myself. Of course not. I'd just transmit something like, hey, the coppers are on the way out of town. Now, it could have been 30 towns, but I made a significant contribution to road safety because everybody slowed down. They all slowed down. I want to tell you another one of my, that's the setup of a King Air, and that's how they're loaded. See that ramp? The stretcher slides up that ramp. I don't know who that person was. I like that shot. It's not a bad shot, is it?
Who took it?
Not me. Except I did take this one. My one regret about this is I left my flight plan on the panel. See it up there in the left? It sort of spoiled it. This was on the way back from Rocky early one morning, and I just popped out of the top of this cloud. Now, this is a bad shot because it's not a King Air. It's a PC-12. We had those for quite some time. Some of the other sections of the RFDS have still got them, but they were a good aeroplane. Seen that 1,000 times, probably more. I want to tell you about a guy called Jack Curtis. Anybody know Jack Curtis?
Yes.
Who knows up the back? Oh, you know Jack?
Yep.
You know Jack. Jack was a lovely, lovely man. He was very involved in the early days of Temora, the museum. And I told you, the slides have got nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I warned you. But Jack Curtis Jack Curtis is a lovely person. He joined the Royal Air Force in 1943, and his first active service was after the Battle of Monte Cassino, when the Italians were being thrown out of North Italy. And his first aeroplane was a P-40. Then he flew the early Mustangs, the early P-51s, not with that canopy, but the straight slide canopy. When he came home from Europe, and when he was discharged from the Royal Australian Air Force, he joined TAA. A lot of time in New Guinea on the DC-3. He ended up as the fleet captain DC-3 for TAA. Well, now one day I got a call from one of our gurus in Canberra who said, "Rigo, how much tail dragger time have you got?" I had a fair bit, you know, and bloody Cessna 180s and Tiger Moth, Hornet Moth, all those sorts of things. And I said, "Oh, a bit." And he said, "Good, we're looking for the DC-3 type specialist and you're it." And I went, "Oh, great." Thank you very much. The one thing I really liked about the concept, it was an aeroplane you could taxi with your arm out the window. And that meant it had to have a bit of class, didn't it? Now, this is very typical of Rico. So at the end of my endorsement on the DC-3, as we were approaching the 5 hours that you had to do, all the way through the training, Jack said to me, "Tail down wheeler, tail down wheeler." And what he was interested, how many people have flown the DC-3? Okay. So what he wanted was, you know, the tail wheel probably about this high at the touchdown. Now, I was a senior examiner of airmen. I was a god. And I got this bloke saying, no, tail down wheeler, not 3-pointers, and everything else I'd always 3-pointed. So we had a couple of circuits to do. This was runway 29 at Darwin, going up the hill. And I turned to Jack and I said, "Jack, can I try a 3-pointer?" And he said, "I'd much rather you do a tail down wheeler, but if you insist." So he came around the corner at 86 knots, 85 knots, 87 knots was not acceptable to this fella. It'd be 86 knots. So around we came. I did the flare and the tail wheel beat the mains by about that much. And it bounced. And I thought, this is a bit embarrassing. So I reflared it and it bounced a bit more. And then it bounced a bit more. And then I had to put a bit of power on to save it. And eventually I sort of saved it and I was a bit embarrassed. And at this stage, Jack had never touched the controls during the whole endorsement process. And then he said in his voice, Mike Alpha, request backtrack, line up, runway 29. So they said, backtrack, line up, runway 29. And he's backtracking. And this was one of the great lessons in humility. Now, bear in mind, senior examiner of airmen, little god, no, big god. And Jack took over and he's taxiing back and he pointed his finger like this at me. And he said, "You stick to wheelers, son." Now that kicked my milking stool clean from under me. And guess what? I was stuck to wheelers. They're easier and they're safer. And they're safer. Love that shot. Now this is an interesting one. Bill, you'll know these blokes. Graham Vonoff, who's passed away recently. Now, that compartment on the back of the engine on a Beech 200, there's one on the left and one on the right. That compartment was used to store the loading gear that allowed you to put the patient in. You saw it before, what they were doing. And we're picking up a bloke at Cunnamulla. Cunnamulla is a fascinating place. It's fascinating because we always had to fuel ourselves, and the chap out there was running the place, or the airfield, always put a couple of drums on a bit of a dolly, and we used to take it out and then we'd hand pump. The second interesting thing is they got some money from the state government and they put a big kangaroo proof fence round the airfield. What I could never imagine was that there were cousins of kangaroos and uncles and aunts and sons and daughters on both sides of the fence. And I always felt that was really, really sad. But Cunnamulla was also the place that one of the funny things happened to me. We picked up an old chap, and the interesting thing is a lot of Western Queenslanders have never been in an aeroplane. That actually surprised me, really surprised me. Anyway, we picked up this old chap. On the crew was a doctor, a nice guy, and Marie Cummins, who was one of our very long-serving nurses, still there after 30-odd years. And they had the patient, and they were discussing it with the local doctor and the local delivery nurse. They were discussing what happened to the patient. And I took the patient on the trolley and I took him down to load him on the aeroplane when they were ready. And he beckoned me down. He went like that. And I put my ear down there and he pointed at this thing here. And he said, "You're not going to put me in there, are you?" And then my nurse, who was a really, really smart lady and still is, I said, "Nurse Cummins, yes? What do you reckon, Mr. Kafup's here? We might make an exception and put him in there with us." And she said, "Oh, I don't know. Oh, I don't know." And I said, "We'll put you in there with us. Now, this is an exception, but you've got to behave." "I'll behave myself." So that was that's my memory of Cunnamulla. I've got lots of memories of Cunnamulla. I've got lots of memories of early mornings, but they're usually late nights, not early mornings. This is Jeffrey Robert Brock, who Bill knows. Interesting. He was about your course, wasn't he?
One behind.
One behind you? Yeah. He graduated from my course at RMC. He left his Army pilot's course after having done Point Cook and after, I think, with about 3 rides to go for reasons I don't know. And then Eric Donaldson at Oakey, who was our senior medical officer, he was the son of the Donaldson who was one of the very first pilots at Longreach for Qantas. He recognised that he was pretty smart. They sent him to medical school. He did very well. He went to England. He served at RAF Valley and a few other places. And when he was a lieutenant colonel, the Corps director at the time, Rotary Ross Harding, said, "Colonel Brock, can you give me a couple of afternoons a week?" And Brocky said, "What for?" He said, "I'm going to put you back to the pilot's course and you can finish." So Brocky, as a lieutenant colonel, medical corps officer, got the wings. Now, I was the only badge pilot out of my class, and I was really pissed off with this. But he's a good friend, a very, very good friend. Pretty typical day. The PC-12 was a good platform, no doubt about that. It was a good platform. Taking notes. Who's the guy on the left?
Flynn.
John Flynn. Reverend John Flynn. I didn't meet him, by the way.
Yeah.
Now, this was my most enjoyable encounter with the Nomad. As a reservist, I was called back to test fly all the aeroplanes that we had stored at Oakey, to go down and take the aeroplanes out of storage at some place on the river, on the Murray, can't remember the name of it, and then organise them to be ferried to the Indonesian Navy. And if you have a look at it, they've got the Indonesian Navy. This was taken at somewhere in the Gulf, and I also had to train some instructors for the Indonesian Navy. Now, let me tell you, training and instruction on a new aeroplane that they haven't seen with students who didn't really understand English very well was a very, very difficult job. And one of the happiest days of my life was the last Nomad taking off from Darwin to go to Indonesia. My heart soared like the bird.
Are they all N22s?
No, they're N24s. See the slightly longer nose? Some of the ones that I picked up from the storage on the Murray River, can't remember the place, they only had 20 or 30 hours on them. They'd been manufactured, they'd been test flown, and then they went into storage, which was interesting. But I was glad to see the end of them. It didn't have a very sophisticated panel. That was it. The later ones had a radar. Those white ones you saw, they would have had a radar. That's the PC-12 panel. I'll just leave that there for a moment. One of our very long-serving doctors. He was a doctor, medical officer with us for about 30 years. Wonderful guy. One of the good things about working for the RFDS Queensland is you could just pull up outside the pub in Mukundra. Now, this is the bad bit. This is coming home. This is coming home early in the morning. And there was a lot of those. The Porter was a very, very interesting aeroplane. Very interesting aeroplane. It was a very good short field takeoff and landing aeroplane. It was easy to fly. It had an ashtray on the panel. And there was the General Officer commanding Buddy's training command at the time, a bloke called General Henderson. He was a chain smoker. He'd roll one, he'd smoke it, he'd stub it out, and when the ashtray got full, he'd hand it to you. Yeah. So my role was to open the door, empty the ashtray, and hand it back to him. Oh, and I was flying the aeroplane, but that was the most important bit, was that bit there.
That the smoke coming out of the cockpit?
Could well be. Yeah. Good observation, sir. That's 200. Brocky? The Army Aviation Association is a very strong association. Well led in previous times. Bill was our president for quite some years. And it is a strong association and will remain so. That was a day at work. I used to fly one day and one night a week so the troops could see it, the silly old fella could actually do it, which I thought was leadership by example, except at 4 o'clock in the morning when you're coming home from Mount Isa. And then I didn't go much on that leadership by example rubbish. I think that's Cunnamulla. I'm not sure. Now, let me tell you about this. I can tell you some interesting stories about this one. Now I've got another 10 minutes. That's the Fokker DR1 triplane. It came from somewhere, donated to the RAF Museum, and we decided, VHALU, we decided we're going to put it on the register, and we decided we were going to fly it. So the department came out and said, oh, well, before you do that, this was at Point Cook when I was there as a young major. You'll have to have a flight manual. So I wrote a flight manual. I looked at the other day, I thought this was totally worthless, but it was a flight manual. One of the interesting things about this aeroplane, the top one, who's got those shuttle blinds at home? Anyone? Yeah. Okay. Well, landing it was like absolutely closing the shutters. Absolutely. Because the interplane thing on the bottom and then the three wings, when you flared it, you couldn't see anything. It was just a series of things in front of you. And it didn't have any brakes. So the only way you could land is hold your head and see if you could pick up any movement. The tail was interesting. You had to actually hold pressure on the pedals to keep the rudder in the centre. If you took your feet off the rudders, then that thing would basically go well out to the left or the right, depending on how it was. And we flew it in a team. There was a guy who was very, very good in the Sopwith pup. He owned it. He was an ophthalmologist from Geelong. And we took these two aeroplanes round and we used to do quite a few air shows. He was Sir Percy Goodfellow and I was Baron von Nasty. We did a big air show at Point Cook. There was over 100,000 people. It just sort of grew. And when we did it, and on the last flyby of the crowd, I did a quick split-ass turn and ended up behind him and shot him down. So a lady, and I flew the Tiger Moth in formation for you. It was a very busy day. Anyway, I was walking back through the crowd and a lady came up and said, "Oh, I'd like to introduce you to my son." And he was a kid, I don't know, 8, 10 years of age. And he said, and the Sopwith pup driver was with me. And he said, this is Sir Percy Goodfellow. "Hello, Sir Percy. And this is Baron von Nasty." The kid kicked me in the balls. Sorry about the language, but I thought to myself, right, well, I won't be doing that again. I got a phone call in my office at Point Cook. And our secretary downstairs said, "The AOC Support Command wants to talk to you. Billy Hicks Collings." Anyone ever met him? Yeah. Oh, Billy Hicks, lovely bloke. He was a Korean veteran in vampires. And then he went and did the experimental test pilots course. I don't know whether he did Pax River or he might have done the one in the UK, Boscombe Down. And he came on and said, "Is that you, Grunt?" They call you Grunt. And I said, "Yes, sir, it's me. I want to come out and fly that bloody triplane of yours." I said, "Oh, yes, sir. What time?" And he said, "I'll be there in an hour or something." So I got it out and fueled it up and all that sort of stuff. And then I prepared a bit of a brief for him, but I sadly underestimated the experimental test pilots. He said, "Tell me about this thing." And I said, "Well, sir, you don't want to do any aerobatics and you're going to be really careful with this aeroplane." And he said, "Yeah, all right, I've heard all that crap." Anyway, we started it and got away. And 2 minutes later, he's wringing its neck. It's upside down, it's pulled through and all this sort of stuff. And I thought, oh my God. Anyway, he landed and he taxied over to where his big white car was with the 2 stars. And he got out and said, "You're full of crap. It's a pussy." I said, "Thank you very much, sir. It's a pussy." But the other thing I remember this aeroplane for is that I was doing circuits one day with a Channel 9 helicopter who happened to be an ex-army pilot. And he'd just finished and peeled away and the top flew off the engine, basically. The whole top of a cylinder came off, went past my head and I got covered in oil and all sorts of stuff. And I was very lucky. I just turned it left and landed across the airfield at Point Cook, avoiding the pine trees outside the officers' mess. I've still actually got the cylinder that lost its top. I've got it at home. But that's an experience I'll never forget. Fokker triplane, loved it, hated it, frightened me. Absolutely frightened me. Now, this guy is really, really interesting fella. My CO at the time, Wing Commander Ronald James McGrath, OAM, AFC, or whatever way around. He said, "Grunt, the Air Force have got a bloke out for Air Force Week. I want you to take him flying. World War II bloke." "Yes, sir, of course." So there he is before I took him flying in the CT4. His name is, he was known as Hamish Mahadi, but that wasn't his actual name. His full name was something else. Hamish, because he bought a horse, which was a Hamish. I've never heard of a Hamish, but anyway. So there's Hamish Mahadi, DSO, DFC, AFC and Bar, and a full member of the Royal Aeronautical Society. And he was out as the guest of the RAAF that year being 1983. So I made the poor assumption that he was a fighter pilot. And I thought, he's a Battle of Britain bloke. So I took him in the Parrot, the plastic Parrot, and I turned it upside down, inside out, and all that sort of stuff. And when I get back, I said, "How was that?" And he said, it nearly made me sick. And I said, why did it nearly made you sick? He said, I've never flown upside down very much. He said, I flew Lancasters before I was a Pathfinder. We didn't do a lot of aerobatics. And I thought to myself, you idiot, Rico, you idiot, you absolute idiot. So he's a lovely bloke, Hamish Mahadi. He passed away, obviously, some years ago, but very lovely guy. Now, there's a couple of things I'd like to just say. I have been very, very fortunate in being brought up within the aviation industry at the time that I was. Many of my instructors, all of my instructors had operational experience. Doug Nazette, who was the CFI of the Royal Queensland Aero Club. I flew with him from December 72 when I was up here. He taught me a lot. Ron Pill at Canberra Aero Club. Wonderful fellow, absolutely wonderful fellow. I learned a lot from him. And Stan Hone at the Royal Newcastle Aero Club. I learned an awful lot from him. So my whole period was brought up, and including in Army and at Point Cook as a student. Many of the people that I flew with handed on a lot of information and a lot of experience. And I was very, very lucky. Very lucky. But the bottom line is, I suppose I've made so many mistakes, and it's luck. I shouldn't be here. I had to write a one-page history for my RMC graduates' 50th wedding anniversary, graduation. And I started off saying, well, I'm not a religious man, and I'm not really. So one day God looked down at me and he said, Rico, listen in, buddy. I've looked after you and all the mistakes and things that you've done wrong over 50 years, and I've had a gutful. You are on your own, mate. No, I went away and thought about that. So I stopped flying. And I think, considering my history, I made a very significant contribution to aviation safety by not flying and road safety. Now, look, there's other things I want to talk about, but there's not, because I'm about 2.5 minutes away from getting a bit of a glare from the other end of the table there. Let me just check if there's other fibs that I haven't told you. One last one. Operation Cendrawassi was in Irian Jaya, a place called Mokma, which I notice either the Russians or the Chinese want to take it over in the last couple of weeks. We had caribous there to move people around. We had Hueys. Hueys were putting the survey teams in, and some pretty high country around Carsten's Top, 17,800 feet or whatever it was. Caribous, Hueys, and I had a porter there. And my porter was the very early days of equipment called Aerodist. Well, I've got about 2 minutes, have I? Aerodist. And that was pretty interesting. One of the senior officers was visiting from Australia, and he wanted to go over to the Bird's Head area. I think the place was called Nabiri, or Nabarre for some people. Now, I didn't see this happen, but I was told by very, very reliable Air Force friends. They had a Huey over there for 2 weeks, and the 2 pilots, who were good guys, wanted to have a welcome to the senior Australian officer. Now picture the scene. We couldn't speak their place talk. They couldn't speak English. Very few people could speak Indonesian because it wasn't that long after that whole area became part of the Republic of Indonesia. So this chap arrived. Let's call him Marmaduke. Let's call this senior officer Marmaduke because I don't want to really let go who he is. So, no, it's not you, Bill. And I didn't see this, but it was told to me, and I do believe what happened. So they went over there, and the whole village was lined up, ready to use some English words, which they didn't understand, to welcome this chap. So he got out of the aeroplane. I think it was a Caribou took him over there, and he walked up to the village, and they were all there, and he nodded like that. And as a group of about 30 or 40 people, they all started, "Head job, Marmaduke, head job, Marmaduke." And everybody was absolutely stunned. They didn't know what they were saying. And you could only do that in the early days of Indonesia and get away with it. Now, that's the last story, and I hope you forgive me for using that language. That's my last story that I want to share with you. I took a different approach. Some of those things were interesting, I hope. Some of them, I hope, were humorous. Does anybody have any really important questions?
Yes, Rico. Rick, Ken Bramhead from Victoria.
Hello, Ken.
How do you do, sir?
Good. You're one of those people who really influenced me. And
usually in the bar, I have to say.
well, I was the president of the mess. It was helping the profits, mate.
No, I hold you in high regard, Rick, and it's been most interesting. And indeed, you showed me a few things in the Nomad and the Porter, which I'll never forget.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ken. That's very kind of you.
And the DC-3.
And the DC-3. Yes.
Well done.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm Darryl Holden, as you know, Air Force guy. So seeing the humorous anecdotes you've had, Rick, I just want to establish, is your name not Peter? You have no Peter in your name at all?
No.
Because I was on the 76 floods out there in Western New South Wales. And I think it was in Burke, you know, Darling was about 20 k's wide. And someone was trying to contact the porter pilot, the Army porter pilot. And it's in the 5 Squadron line book now, and I still remember it. And they came back, and the senior guy said, "Where's that Army porter pilot?" And this is involving alliteration, right? That's all it's about. And the Mirage pilot just transferred onto Huey's at the time, came back and said, "Peter, the porter pilot, is drinking piss at the post office pub." So I want to know who the hell Peter was after all these years.
Yeah, it's very clever. Yes, I do.
Anybody else for any in the crowd here? No? Anybody online got a question or a story?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was fascinating.